"You don't belong in seat 2A. This ticket must be stolen." The words came sharp and cold from Victoria Clark's mouth, slicing the cabin's low murmur like a blade drawn too quickly. No greeting, no hint of courtesy, only a blunt accusation flung before a cabin of affluent travelers now turning to stare, some with amusement, others with quiet curiosity. Olivia Harris stood still, her tailored black hoodie falling softly over her shoulders, the sleeves neatly pushed back just above her wrists, exposing her slim gold bracelet. A subtle but deliberate choice, the kind of detail too easily missed by those determined not to see. Victoria's arm blocked her path with calculated authority. Her lips tightened into a line that suggested finality, her blue eyes gleaming not with protocol but with preconception. The air was dense, weighted not just by the recycled oxygen of the aircraft, but by something far older. Judgment delivered swiftly, publicly, and without doubt. Behind Olivia, the narrow jet bridge still pressed passengers forward, the shuffle of shoes against carpet mingling with the impatient sighs of a crowded Monday morning. Yet inside the cabin, time had stopped for her. Every breath drawn against the thick silence of strangers who believed they knew what they were seeing. Charles Blake, seated in 2C, leaned into the aisle, a smirk curling at the edge of his mouth. "Jeans and a hoodie in first class? Doesn't look quite right, does it?" His voice dripped with condescension, smooth and well-practiced, honed by years of boardroom dismissals and golf club whispers. Olivia's gaze did not flicker, did not tremble. Her breath was slow, deliberate, her spine straight as she met Victoria's stare without apology or explanation. She held her boarding pass lightly in one hand, extending it with the kind of grace that should have required no defense. The paper was crisp, bearing her name, her full name, and the printed seat assignment. 2A, Priority 1, clearance confirmed. But none of it seemed to matter. Victoria snatched the boarding pass, her fingers brushing against Olivia's wrist but recoiling as if contact itself confirmed suspicion. Without so much as a glance at the barcode, Victoria's verdict fell. "This doesn't match our manifest. Step aside while we sort this out." Several rows back, a phone rose slowly. Maya Thompson, seated quietly in 3D, had begun filming, her lens steady and intent. She did not speak. Yet, she did not need to. The camera itself was a statement that what was unfolding would not be allowed to dissolve into rumor or be forgotten. At that moment, a memory returned unbidden to Olivia's mind. A moment years ago, in another airport, where a ticket agent had waved her toward the economy gate without checking her name, eyes darting dismissively over the hoodie she wore then, too. The hurt of that encounter had not faded. It had not healed. It had hardened, settling deep into the core of the woman she had become. It had taught her this silence, the silence she held now, not as submission, but as preparation. Victoria spoke again, louder this time, aware of the growing interest from the cabin's occupants. "We've had payment issues today. If your card failed, you can't sit here, no matter what this paper says." Her tone balanced at the edge of patronizing, sharpened by the assumption that Olivia would either protest or retreat. Olivia did neither. Instead, she turned slightly, allowing her assistant Noah Grant to step forward. Noah's phone was already recording discreetly from the corner of his hand, his eyes calm but watchful. He did not speak either. His presence alone was enough to signal that this confrontation was no accident and would not be erased. A ripple of discomfort passed through the nearest passengers as Charles Blake chuckled softly. "Maybe she found that ticket somewhere," he suggested with a casual air, looking deliberately past Olivia as if she were no longer part of the conversation. But Olivia's presence was undeniable, her stillness itself a refusal to shrink beneath their gaze. She spoke at last, her voice low and deliberate, but every syllable carved with clarity. "You haven't verified anything, Miss Clark. You haven't scanned this ticket, and you haven't asked for identification." Victoria's cheeks flushed, but she held her ground, eyes darting briefly toward her handheld tablet, its screen dim, its connection lagging. "The system isn't showing your name. That's enough for me." Olivia inclined her head by a fraction, a gesture of acknowledgement but not consent. "Then let's be clear," she said quietly. "The problem is not my name. The problem is your system." The line, spoken gently, landed hard in the hush that followed. Thomas Reynolds, seated quietly in 1D, shifted in his chair, his expression unreadable but attentive. Maya's camera zoomed slightly, framing the tableau. Olivia Harris, black hoodie, calm expression, surrounded by doubt, but unbent. Charles Blake broke the silence with one final jab, words meant to provoke and diminish. "Look at her," he said to no one and everyone. "Looks like she's dressed for a gym, not first class. No offense, but appearances matter." Olivia turned fully toward him, her voice steady, almost gentle, but with a steel edge beneath the velvet. "Appearances do matter, Mr. Blake, especially when they reveal so much." And then, before Victoria could summon security, before Lucas Reed, the second attendant, could intervene, Olivia did something unexpected. She reached slowly into her small leather bag and drew out her wallet, not rushing, not rattled. From it, she extracted an embossed black card and a corporate ID, both bearing the same name as her boarding pass. She held them up. Not for Victoria, not for Charles Blake, but for the watching cabin, and said calmly, "My name is Olivia Harris. I own 40% of Skylight Airlines, and you've just made a decision you will regret for the rest of your career." Her words settled over the cabin like a sudden drop in altitude, a collective breath held and then released in a silence far heavier than any noise that could have filled it. The true journey was just beginning. The silence after Olivia Harris's declaration felt almost unnatural, like the air had thickened inside the narrow fuselage, every molecule charged with unease and disbelief. Victoria Clark's fingers trembled slightly as she clutched the dimly lit tablet, her gaze darting between Olivia's boarding pass, the flawless black card, and the ID now held firmly aloft. The passengers seated nearby did not look away. They watched with sharpened attention, leaning just subtly forward, breathing quieter than before. Lucas Reed approached from the galley, a polished smile stretched tight across his face, betraying a desperation to restore control. "Ma'am," he said quickly, his tone wrapped in forced civility, "we're experiencing technical issues this morning. If you'd just allow us a moment to sort this out." But Olivia did not budge. Her posture remained serene yet immovable, her eyes fixed calmly on Victoria, not Lucas. The gesture itself, ignoring his attempt to redirect her attention, was an assertion of quiet authority. It wasn't Lucas she was speaking to, and everyone could sense it. Behind her, Noah Grant stood as steady as a shadow, the phone in his hand recording unobtrusively but deliberately. His role was clear, not to intervene or escalate, but to document without fail. Every expression, every tremor in Victoria's voice, every sideways glance from Lucas, all of it now preserved beyond denial. Victoria finally found her voice again, though it cracked as she spoke. "It's standard procedure to verify questionable tickets. You can't expect me to allow someone into first class when their name doesn't appear on the system." Her words sounded rehearsed, a phrase pulled directly from the training manual she clung to now like a life raft. From seat 3, Maya Thompson finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, but her words were deliberate. aimed like an arrow at the heart of the moment. "You haven't even scanned her ID yet, Victoria. We all see that." She didn't need to lift her phone higher. Everyone knew she was still recording. Charles Blake, whose earlier smirk had faded into a more defensive sneer, leaned back in his seat but couldn't resist muttering, "This is getting ridiculous. She's stalling the entire flight for a performance." His words were coated in casual disdain, spoken loud enough for passengers in adjacent rows to hear, but soft enough that he could plausibly deny intent if challenged. Olivia did not look at him. Her focus remained on Victoria, her patience exacting. "You are free to verify this card, this ID, this ticket," she said, her voice still measured, not yet rising but carrying a weight that filled the narrow aisle. "But what you're not free to do is make assumptions about who belongs here and who does not, before you even attempt verification." Victoria hesitated, caught between her growing embarrassment and the rigid posture of habit, the unspoken culture she had absorbed over years on this job, a culture that taught her that certain appearances required closer scrutiny. She swallowed hard, then turned her tablet slightly toward Lucas, whispering, "Run a manual check, quickly." Lucas nodded, tapping clumsily at the sluggish device, the small screen flickering and resisting his commands. The glitch in the payment system was real. Several passengers earlier that morning had also complained about failed check-ins, but this situation felt different, personal, charged. Thomas Reynolds, still seated in 1D, cleared his throat gently but firmly. "Ms. Clark, may I suggest something?" His tone was soft, but it held the confidence of age and experience, and when he spoke, heads turned toward him instinctively. "You are digging a deeper hole by persisting in appearances over facts. There's a woman standing before you who is showing her ID, her boarding pass, and her patience. What exactly are you waiting for?" Victoria flushed deeply now, the color rising in her cheeks, but even as Thomas's words rang through the cabin, she clung to the threadbare justification of procedure. "I'm responsible for passenger security, sir," she said, almost pleadingly, but her words fell flat in the heavy air. Security. The word had become her shield, a thin, fragile shield, cracking under the gaze of nearly every passenger now watching intently. Lucas looked down at the tablet, then up at Victoria and shook his head slowly. Her name isn't showing on the digital manifest, still flagged as pending clearance. He avoided eye contact with everyone as he spoke, his voice quiet and brittle. Olivia tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanged. "Your system is broken," she repeated, each word deliberate and clear. "But I am not." A pause settled then, longer than any before, and into that silence came the unmistakable sound of Maya Thompson's voice, soft, unwavering, and echoing what everyone now understood. "It's not the system that flagged her, Victoria. You did." Victoria stiffened. The implication could no longer be dodged or blurred. It was not the malfunctioning technology, not the glitching tablet, not the payment issue. It was her instinct. An instinct shaped by a culture too long unchecked. At that precise moment, Charles Blake leaned forward again, unable to help himself. "Why not just let security handle this? Honestly, I've flown enough times to know what this looks like." He smiled as he said it, as if that smile could soften the meaning behind the words. But Thomas Reynolds did not smile. He turned in his seat and met Charles's gaze with a calmness that felt almost chilling. "Yes, Mr. Blake," he said gently, "you do know what this looks like. We all do." And with that, the fragile equilibrium that had held Victoria's stance together cracked fully. Her fingers tightened around the tablet. Her voice was smaller now. "I'm following procedure," she murmured. But the truth was laid bare for all to see. This was no longer about policy. This was about perception. And Olivia Harris, composed, watchful, and utterly unshaken, stood at the very center of that revelation, making no move to retreat. The tension in the cabin didn't ease, it deepened, and everyone felt it. Victoria Clark's fingers trembled as she clutched the malfunctioning tablet tighter, her mind spinning faster than the lagging software could process. Around her, the cabin seemed to close in, rows of curious, silent passengers watching her every move, waiting to see what she would do next, some leaning forward just enough to catch every expression on her face, others covertly glancing at their phones as if preparing to record if needed. But it was Olivia Harris who commanded the space, despite not raising her voice, despite standing perfectly still in her black hoodie and crisp dark jeans, despite offering neither argument nor apology. She didn't have to. The accusation hung in the air, unanswered, that Victoria had chosen instinct over evidence, appearance over fact. Lucas Reed, hovering near the galley, stepped forward again, his voice cracking as he tried to regain control. "Perhaps we can move Ms. Harris to another seat temporarily, just until this can be sorted," he offered, his tone falsely smooth but strained beneath the surface. His words were meant to sound like compromise, but they only exposed the growing fracture in his authority. Olivia did not even turn to face him. She addressed Victoria directly, as if Lucas's presence was irrelevant now. "If you believe my ticket is invalid, then you must explain," she said evenly. "But you haven't explained anything. You've made assumptions, and assumptions demand accountability." Behind her, Noah Grant's phone remained steady, capturing every moment, every word, every sideways glance from Victoria and Lucas as they exchanged a brief, silent conversation laced with fear and indecision. Maya Thompson, still filming from her seat, raised her voice gently but firmly. "She's standing right there, presenting a valid ID, a boarding pass, and even offering her corporate credentials. What exactly are you waiting for?" Victoria's throat tightened. She could feel her pulse racing now, feel the weight of her uniform suddenly heavier on her shoulders, and yet her training, flawed as it was, demanded that she stand her ground. "The manifest isn't updated," she insisted weakly. "Until we verify, she can't sit here." Charles Blake couldn't resist another jab, his voice loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear, yet still couched in mock politeness. "If we delay this flight for one passenger playing dress-up, that's on her," he said, a dismissive smile curling at the corner of his mouth as he crossed one leg over the other and sipped from his coffee, feigning disinterest. Olivia turned her head just slightly toward him, meeting his gaze with quiet precision. "Mr. Blake?" she said, her tone like ice under velvet. "It's not the hoodie you object to. It's the person wearing it." Her words landed heavily, eliciting a ripple of murmured agreement from several passengers seated nearby, soft but audible, like the stirrings of conscience surfacing in a room where everyone had seen what they had not wanted to name. Thomas Reynolds, his hands calmly folded on the armrests of seat 1D, spoke again, his voice deep and even but resonant with a quiet authority that drew attention immediately. "We're not watching a misunderstanding unfold here," he said slowly. "We're watching prejudice dressed up as protocol." Lucas Reed froze mid-gate, his fingers hovering over the tablet as if unsure whether to proceed or retreat. The air inside the cabin seemed to grow heavier still, charged now with something more than tension, a recognition that the moment had tipped, that what had begun as an isolated confrontation had become something larger, something undeniable. Victoria's voice cracked as she tried to salvage control. "Sir, if you don't mind," she began, but Thomas cut her off gently, shaking his head. "I do mind," he said simply, "because I've seen this before, and I know how it ends when nobody speaks." For the first time, Victoria's confidence faltered fully. She glanced sideways at Lucas, but he offered no rescue, his expression a mirror of uncertainty and guilt. It was Olivia who broke the stalemate. Not by raising her voice or stepping forward, but by turning calmly to Noah Grant and speaking just loudly enough for all to hear. "Noah," she said, her voice smooth and deliberate, "text the board liaison. Inform them this situation requires immediate attention." Noah's fingers moved swiftly across his phone screen, his face expressionless but intent. The subtle click of his thumb tapping send was barely audible, but it carried the force of inevitability. Victoria swallowed hard, watching helplessly as her control slipped away, aware now that this was no ordinary passenger confrontation, no fleeting complaint that could be soothed or silenced before takeoff. And then Olivia spoke again, her voice lower now, quieter, but sharper, cutting through the thick cabin air with surgical precision. "You've just made this personal," she said to Victoria. "But the correction that follows will be institutional." A hush settled across the cabin, deeper and more profound than before. A hush that came not from confusion or delay, but from dawning realization. This woman standing before them wasn't just another passenger. She was the power they hadn't recognized. Victoria's tablet beeped faintly, a failed sync message blinking at the top of the screen. Her face paled. Noah's voice, steady and professional, followed immediately. "Confirmation received," he said quietly, but loud enough that every passenger could hear. "The board has acknowledged the incident. Executive oversight is now active." And for the first time since Olivia Harris had stepped aboard the aircraft, Victoria Clark looked afraid. Not of the glitching manifest, not of delayed verification, but of the truth finally being recorded in real time, in full view of a cabin that would not forget what they had seen. The atmosphere inside first class had shifted entirely. What began as hushed curiosity had transformed into riveted attention. No passenger now pretended not to watch. Even those who earlier avoided eye contact sat upright, alert, their gaze locked on Olivia Harris as she stood, composed and unshaken, at the threshold of seat 2A. Victoria Clark seemed frozen in place, her fingers gripping the failing tablet like a talisman that no longer protected her. Lucas Reed's polite facade had collapsed completely, replaced by a haunted look, his gaze darting between Olivia and the tablet, as though it could somehow erase what had already unfolded. Noah Grant stepped forward, his phone still recording steadily, and spoke again with precision and finality. "Executive oversight confirmed. Ms. Harris's credentials are validated directly through Skylight Corporate." His words fell into the dense silence with the weight of a gavel striking wood. Victoria's lips parted, but no defense came. Her throat worked, but the usual excuses, protocol, policy, security concerns, no longer felt viable. They rang hollow in a cabin that had borne witness to her judgment before any verification had even been attempted. Charles Blake let out a soft, incredulous scoff from seat 2C. "So what? You're telling me she owns the airline now?" His tone aimed to inject cynicism, but even he could not mask the growing uncertainty in his voice. And Olivia turned slightly, her gaze steady and unblinking as she met his eyes. Her voice when she spoke was quiet but deliberate, carrying to every ear in the cabin without effort. "Yes, Mr. Blake," she said, her tone neither triumphant nor angry but simply true. "I do." She reached into her bag again, this time producing a slim leather wallet, from which she withdrew a single card, black, minimalist, embossed only with her name and title. Olivia Harris, co-owner, Skylight Airlines. She held it aloft, not for Victoria, not even for Lucas or Charles, but for the entire cabin to see. The gesture was not for effect. It was a confirmation, a simple, irrefutable statement that beneath the hoodie, behind the calm exterior, sat authority beyond their assumptions. A ripple moved through the cabin, a collective intake of breath as several passengers leaned forward, eyes narrowing not in suspicion now, but in recognition. Thomas Reynolds spoke first, his voice low but laced with unmistakable respect. "I believe that settles the matter." He glanced at Victoria, whose flushed face had drained of its defiance, and then at Charles Blake, who had gone notably quiet. Maya Thompson slowly lowered her phone, her expression one of grim satisfaction, though the camera's recording lights still glowed, a signal that this moment would live beyond the confines of the aircraft. Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she attempted one last feeble protest. "I was just following procedure. It's standard to—" But Olivia cut through her words gently, not loudly but with a precision that silenced the entire section. "No, Ms. Clark," she said, "you were following an unwritten rule, a rule that allowed your assumptions to masquerade as procedure." The words settled heavy and sharp, each passenger now understanding that this was no isolated incident. It was a pattern, a culture. Noah Grant added, his voice professional but unyielding. "All of this is being documented. Audio, video, timestamps, passenger witness statements. Legal is already alerted. Compliance is standing by." Lucas Reed's shoulders slumped, the weight of that reality crashing over him. He looked as though he might speak, but no words formed. Charles Blake, still clinging to his coffee cup as if it might shield him from accountability, shook his head with an incredulous chuckle that carried no humor. "You people," he muttered under his breath, but even he did not finish the sentence. The old defenses, casual dismissal, arrogant deflection, no longer held. Olivia stepped fully into the aisle now, her voice stronger than it had been all morning, yet still controlled, still precise. "Let me be clear," she said. "Your assumptions about who belongs in this seat are no longer protected by your silence, your culture, or your convenience." Victoria swallowed visibly, her composure unraveling thread by thread. Olivia turned back to Noah, nodding once. "Proceed." Noah's thumbs moved quickly over the screen. "Board has authorized full discretion," he confirmed. "You may proceed with immediate action." Olivia inhaled slowly, her posture as calm as it had been from the start, but now suffused with a gravity that no one could miss. She did not need to raise her voice or demand respect. Respect was inherent to her very presence. "Victoria Clark," she said evenly. "Effective immediately, you are relieved of all passenger-facing duties. Your conduct today violated not only the dignity of this passenger, myself, but the standards this airline will now be held to moving forward." A sharp intake of breath moved through the front rows as her words landed like a final verdict. Victoria's mouth opened again, but whatever excuse, apology, or protest she might have spoken died unspoken, withering beneath Olivia's steady gaze. Lucas Reed turned slightly away, shame heavy in his expression, and Charles Blake found nothing more to say. Thomas Reynolds gave a single solemn nod of approval. Maya Thompson lifted her phone one final time, framing Olivia Harris perfectly, and whispered, just loudly enough to be heard by all, "Accountability has arrived." And so it had. As Victoria Clark froze, the silence in the cabin thickened again, not the uneasy quiet of discomfort, but a hush weighted by revelation. The balance of power had shifted completely, and now every eye rested on Olivia Harris, not as a passenger, but as the rightful authority aboard this flight. Olivia did not rush. She stood composed, letting the gravity of her words and title settle into every corner of the aircraft. She turned briefly to Noah Grant, who gave a subtle nod, his phone still recording with quiet precision, capturing not just events, but evidence. Lucas Reed shifted his weight uneasily, shoulders tight, gaze lowered, a man caught between complicity and self-preservation. Then, unexpectedly, he spoke, not loud, but clear enough to be heard in the tense quiet. "It's not just today," he said, the words sounding almost like a confession. "This isn't the first time this has happened." Victoria's head snapped toward him, eyes wide, a flash of fear now replacing embarrassment. "Lucas," she hissed under her breath, but it was too late. Lucas's hands trembled slightly as he continued, "We've been trained, not officially, but we've been taught to watch for red flags." His voice faltered momentarily under the collective gaze of the cabin, but pressed forward nonetheless. "Baggy clothes, hoodies, sneakers, that kind of thing. We were told it was about fraud, about protecting the airline, but really, it was profiling." The word fell into the space like a stone dropped into deep water, impossible to ignore, and destined to reverberate long after. Thomas Reynolds let out a quiet, sorrowful breath, his lined face reflecting the painful recognition of what had just been admitted aloud. Maya Thompson's phone never wavered, her camera lens catching not just faces but truths. Victoria took a single step forward, her voice breaking slightly. "That's not how we were trained, officially," she stammered. "These were just best practices. Guidance." Olivia met her gaze directly, her voice calm but devastating. Guidance that allowed assumptions to replace verification. Guidance that turned attire into a reason for exclusion. Guidance that no one challenged. Until now. Lucas looked smaller with every word, the facade of authority drained completely from his posture. He nodded, his voice nearly a whisper. "We didn't log complaints either," he admitted, when passengers questioned it. "We'd noted as confusion or misunderstanding. Those complaints never made it to corporate." The cabin held its collective breath. Olivia's face remained composed, but her eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of sadness behind her otherwise steady gaze. "How many complaints, Mr. Reed?" Lucas hesitated, then answered quietly. "At least half a dozen this quarter. Probably more. I only know the ones I handled personally." Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the dawning realization settling over them. This was not a one-time failure. This was a pattern. A system, cultivated in shadows and silence, hidden behind hollow words like security and policy. Charles Blake, who had been unusually quiet, tried one last attempt to reassert control over the conversation, leaning forward in his seat. "This sounds like corporate culture, Ms. Harris," he said. "You can't hold individuals accountable for something bigger than them." Olivia turned toward him slowly, her expression still unreadable. "Mr. Blake," she said evenly, "culture is built and sustained by the choices of individuals, and accountability begins with naming those choices." Her words cut clean and deep, leaving no space for reply. Noah Grant spoke next, his tone precise and efficient, delivering an update that underlined the seriousness of the moment. "Corporate compliance has acknowledged receipt of all documentation. They are preparing an internal audit and have authorized immediate collection of all complaint records from the past 12 months. Victoria's face drained of color. The scope of what was unfolding finally registered, and there would be no salvaging her position now. Her shoulders sagged visibly, her eyes darting about as if searching for an exit that didn't exist. Olivia continued, her voice low but firm. This isn't just about today or this cabin. It's about a culture that allowed appearance to dictate dignity. That stops now. Maya's phone camera followed Olivia as she moved a step closer toward Victoria. Every complaint ignored, every passenger judged for their attire instead of their ticket, every assumption that went unchallenged will now be accounted for. Lucas's voice came again, softer but almost pleading. "We were afraid. Too many complaints and you'd lose route eligibility, bonuses, even promotions. We thought we were protecting our jobs." Olivia nodded slowly, the smallest gesture of understanding but not forgiveness. "Fear is not an excuse, Mr. Reed," she said gently. "Fear is the soil where injustice takes root." Thomas Reynolds, his voice low and thoughtful, added, "You didn't just protect your jobs, you protected a lie." And so the truth lay bare, not in rumor or speculation, but in confession, spoken openly before witnesses who would not forget. Olivia Harris stood at the center of it all, not triumphant, not vengeful, but resolute. The systemic failure had been named, exposed, and correction would follow. A quiet settled in the cabin, not an awkward or embarrassed quiet, but a heavy, contemplative silence, the kind that arrives when something undeniable has been spoken aloud. The passengers now sat straighter, their glances sharper, no longer passive observers, but witnesses to a truth they could not unsee. Victoria Clark lowered her head, shoulders rounded inward, shrinking under the invisible weight of what she and Lucas Reed had admitted. No longer shielded by routine or authority, she looked not like an enforcer of policy, but like someone stranded at the edge of her own choices. Olivia Harris did not move immediately. She let that silence work its way through the space, letting every soul aboard that flight sit with the knowledge that they had just witnessed the collapse of an old order, an order built on assumptions, fears, and unspoken prejudice. Noah Grant, precise as ever, lowered his phone briefly to glance at a message that had just arrived. He nodded once, then raised his voice so all could hear. "Compliance has greenlit immediate corrective authority, full executive discretion. All actions taken today are officially recognized under Skylight Airlines operational bylaws." The official confirmation settled over the cabin like the tolling of a bell. Charles Blake exhaled, a bitter laugh escaping his throat, but he remained silent, unwilling, or perhaps unable, to mount any further defense. His earlier arrogance had curdled into something smaller, meaner, but now irrelevant. Olivia finally stepped forward again, her voice calm and deliberate, addressed not just to Victoria or Lucas, but to every passenger, every crew member, and through Maya Thompson's steady camera lens, to everyone beyond that plane who might one day hear of this moment. "This isn't the end," she said quietly, but with unmistakable resolve. "This is where it starts." Victoria lifted her head slightly, her face pale, her eyes hollow. "I didn't mean to," she began, but the words sounded thin even to herself. Olivia shook her head gently but firmly. "Intent does not erase harm," she replied. "And harm, when ignored, becomes culture. When protected, it becomes policy." Her words were measured and graceful, yet they fell like verdicts. Thomas Reynolds leaned forward in his seat, his hands clasped gently before him, his expression thoughtful. "You're not just correcting today's injustice," he observed softly. "You're rewriting the rules that allowed it to happen." Olivia met his gaze briefly, the faintest nod of acknowledgement passing between them. She turned back to Noah and spoke in a voice loud enough for all to hear. "Effective immediately, we will implement the Skyfare initiative." A murmur rippled through the cabin, curiosity and surprise blending together. Noah, anticipating her next words, continued without pause. Skyfair will establish mandatory bias training for all crew, gate staff, and customer service representatives. Every verbal or written complaint regarding treatment at check-in, boarding, or in-flight will now be logged formally, without exception, without dismissal. Olivia's gaze swept the rows of leather seats, the polished brass fixtures, the carefully curated atmosphere of luxury that had, until this morning, masked a culture of exclusion. Within 60 days, she continued, every employee entrusted with passenger interaction will complete this new training. Internal audits will run quarterly, not annually. Passenger feedback will no longer be filtered or reclassified as misunderstandings. Her voice softened but retained its steel core. Dignity will no longer depend on attire. Respect will no longer be contingent upon appearances. Maya Thompson, who had continued filming throughout, spoke then, not as a journalist but as a citizen, a traveler, a woman who had seen too many moments like this fade into memory without change. "And will the footage from today be part of that training?" she asked carefully. Olivia did not hesitate. "Yes," she said simply, "in full, without edits or disclaimers." A few passengers nodded slowly, even those who had initially kept quiet now visibly moved. For them, this was no longer an isolated conflict between one woman and two flight attendants. This had become a reckoning, a dismantling of habits long left unchallenged. Victoria remained silent, her hands clasped tightly together as if to hold herself steady. Lucas Reed spoke one last time, his voice low but clear, his gaze finally meeting Olivia's. "I want to help fix it," he said. "I can assist with the audits, provide records, cooperate fully." There was no self-pity in his voice, only the weary tone of someone who understood too late what he had been complicit in. Olivia's reply was measured, her gaze unwavering. "You will," she said simply, "not because I trust you, but because you owe it to every passenger you overlooked, every complaint you dismissed." Thomas Reynolds offered one final thought, directed not at Olivia but at the cabin itself. "Today feels like the future being built," he said softly. Olivia's lips curved into the smallest, quietest smile, a smile not of triumph but of resolve. "That's exactly what it is," she said. And with that, the path forward became clear. The Skyfair initiative would begin not as a press release, but as a lived promise, rooted in this moment, aboard this very aircraft. The turning point had come, and there would be no turning back. The cabin of Skylight Flight SE-247 remained utterly still, but the energy had shifted yet again. This time from uncomfortable tension to a quiet acknowledgement that history was being written in real time, seat by seat, witness by witness. Olivia Harris, standing with quiet resolve near seat 2A, was no longer simply the woman in the hoodie who had been denied her rightful seat. She had become the architect of something far larger. A corrective force transforming what could have been a private humiliation into a public reckoning and a blueprint for institutional reform. Noah Grant's voice, calm and precise, cut gently through the charged silence. "Corporate has confirmed the authority of your actions, Ms. Harris. Executive discretion in flight operations has been logged, and HR is prepared to formalize all decisions upon landing." Olivia nodded once, then addressed Victoria Clark directly, her voice steady but without cruelty. "Victoria Clark, as of this moment, you are officially relieved of duty. Your access to Skylight Airlines systems is revoked. HR will follow up with formal termination procedures within 24 hours. Victoria's posture wilted, her shoulders sagged, her mouth opened slightly as if to speak, but no sound came. Whatever she might have said felt irrelevant now. Too late. Too empty. Then Olivia turned to Lucas Reed, her gaze neither condemning nor indulgent but weighted with truth. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice softer but no less authoritative, "your conduct today exposed the quiet complicity that sustains cultures of exclusion." Lucas lowered his head. "I understand," he murmured. "You will not be terminated today," Olivia continued, "but a formal reprimand will be filed in your record. Effective immediately, you are reassigned to internal compliance review. You will assist directly in auditing the very practices you upheld, not because I forgive you, but because accountability means not only acknowledging harm, but repairing it." Lucas swallowed visibly, the weight of his responsibility settling heavily across his face. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. And then her gaze swept across the aisle toward seat 2C, where Charles Blake sat stiffly, arms crossed tightly over his chest, his coffee long forgotten. His smirk had vanished entirely, replaced by a pale and sullen expression that now seemed small, petty, and cornered. "Mr. Blake," Olivia addressed him gently but firmly, "while you are not an employee, your conduct today endangered the dignity and safety of passengers on this flight, and disjoined." Charles straightened slightly, as if preparing to object, but she did not give him the chance. "Effective immediately," she continued, "you are banned from all current and future flights operated by Skylight Airlines and its domestic affiliates. Your behavior today was inflammatory, discriminatory, and disruptive, not only to me but to this entire cabin." A collective intake of breath followed her words, and for once Charles Blake had nothing to say. His eyes darted nervously toward the other passengers, seeking solidarity and finding none. Thomas Reynolds, seated in 1D, spoke quietly but decisively. "That's how consequences should look, clear, precise, and without malice." Maya Thompson, camera still steady in her hands, captured every word, every reaction, the documentation that would soon reach far beyond the confines of this aircraft. Charles let out one last weak protest, his voice brittle. "You can't be serious." Olivia met his gaze evenly. "I am serious, Mr. Blake. Accountability is serious. And your name is already logged in Skylight's flight risk system." Across the cabin, passengers exchanged subtle glances, some solemn, others quietly approving. The atmosphere had transformed into something unfamiliar to many of them, a place where respect was not defined by attire or appearances, but by action and accountability. The Superwillian Apollo. Victoria remained frozen near the galley, her badge still clipped to her uniform, but now little more than an artifact of a position she no longer held. Lucas sat stiffly beside the service cart, the reality of his reassignment sinking deeper. And Charles Blake slumped slightly in his seat, his earlier bravado dissolved completely. Noah Grant checked his phone once more and nodded discreetly to Olivia. "HR has logged all actions. Legal is on standby for enforcement upon arrival at JFK." Olivia allowed herself a single quiet breath. She turned toward the remaining passengers, her voice carrying a clarity that left no room for doubt. "Let it be known," she said gently, "this is not about punishment. It's about restoration." Her words hung in the air like a quiet promise that what had been broken would be repaired, not merely by firing individuals, but by transforming a culture. Maya Thompson, lowering her phone at last, spoke softly but pointedly, and that's what makes this moment historic. Thomas Reynolds nodded thoughtfully, his lined face creased not with cynicism but with hope. "You didn't just reclaim your seat, Ms. Harris," he said quietly. "You reclaimed the dignity that belongs to everyone who ever sat here." Olivia gave a slight gracious nod. That was always the point. And with that, the cabin fell into a silence no longer burdened by fear or tension, but by reflection. The groundwork for change had been laid, and everyone aboard Skylight Flight SE-247 knew they had witnessed something that would ripple far beyond the runway at JFK. By the time Skylight Flight SE-247 broke through the clouds on its final approach to JFK, the passengers on board knew they had witnessed more than just a delay or a difficult boarding. They had watched, almost frame by frame, a moment of quiet but irreversible change. Change set into motion not by noise, threats, or spectacle, but by presence, composure, and truth spoken aloud without apology. Olivia Harris sat now in seat 2A, not with triumph or smugness, but with quiet resolve. The seat that hours earlier had been denied her because of an outdated instinct was now more than hers. It had become a symbol of correction, dignity, and belonging reclaimed. She did not recline. She did not sip champagne or pretend comfort. Her posture remained straight, her eyes steady, her thoughts already beyond the landing gear that would soon touch down. Across the aisle, Charles Blake sat small in his wide leather chair, shoulders hunched, gaze fixed on the seat back in front of him as if hoping the flight would end sooner than scheduled. His earlier smugness was gone, replaced with the dawning realization that his words had not merely been overheard, they had been documented, challenged, and held to account. Near the galley, Victoria Clark sat stiffly on the jump seat, her badge surrendered, headset silenced, uniform now only an outfit without authority. Lucas Reed remained beside her, shoulders lowered, expression distant, knowing that the road ahead for him would be difficult, but necessary. Noah Grant, ever precise, stood quietly by the forward bulkhead, phone in hand, monitoring updates from corporate in real time. Everything that had transpired, every word, every action, every admission, was now permanently logged in Skylight Airlines' system. There would be no erasure, no reinterpretation. Maya Thompson, seated in 3D, finally lowered her camera. The recording was complete. The story now belonged to history and would soon belong to every employee and passenger who stepped aboard a Skylight aircraft. Thomas Reynolds, seated quietly in 1D, spoke aloud one final time as the aircraft began its descent. "It's rare," he said softly, his voice carrying across the still cabin, "to witness a correction as swift and as complete as this one." Olivia met his gaze briefly and inclined her head. "Rare," she agreed, "but overdue." Her voice did not rise, yet it carried. A few passengers nodded subtly, their expressions thoughtful, their eyes meeting hers not with pity, but with respect. The captain's voice came over the intercom, polite, professional, a reminder that this was, after all, still a flight, and thanked the passengers for their patience during an unusual but important operational matter. The announcement was almost redundant. Everyone aboard understood exactly what had unfolded. And as the wheels touched the runway, as the engines reversed with their familiar roar, Olivia turned toward Noah and spoke quietly but with unmistakable clarity. "Upon landing, please ensure security meets us at the gate. Not for me, but to formally escort Victoria Clark off this aircraft with the dignity due the procedure itself." Noah nodded. "Already arranged, Miss Harris." The plane rolled slowly to the gate, the jet bridge extending toward the forward door. The usual ritual of deplaning would not begin immediately. Instead, as the seatbelt sign extinguished, a corporate liaison and 2 security staff stepped aboard quietly, but with authority. Victoria stood before they could ask, her posture rigid but resigned. She said nothing. She did not meet Olivia's gaze. Her footsteps were deliberate but subdued as she followed the liaison and security through the forward exit, her badge clipped back onto her uniform one last time, not as a symbol of duty, but as an artifact soon to be surrendered permanently. Charles Blake remained seated until the security team approached him next, issuing a formal notification of his ban from Skylight Airlines. He stood slowly, without protest, his earlier arrogance drained completely, his silence louder than any argument. Olivia remained seated throughout, calm and observant. There was no gloating, no public display of victory, only the quiet satisfaction of correction enacted properly, without cruelty, but with unwavering clarity. Maya stepped forward before deplaning, her camera now lowered but still present in her hand. She spoke softly to Olivia as she passed. "Thank you," she said simply. "You didn't just claim your seat today. You claimed space for all of us." Olivia smiled faintly, a quiet, reflective smile, and nodded once. "That was always the point," she replied. Thomas Reynolds lingered at the aisle, pausing before exiting. He placed one hand gently on Olivia's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity. "You changed the altitude of this airline today," he said. And Olivia, still seated, looking straight ahead, answered simply, "And we'll keep climbing." As the last passenger left, Noah turned toward her. "Ready to deplane, Ms. Harris?" She took a final breath, steady and deep, and rose slowly from seat 2A. "Let's go," she said. But before stepping off the plane, she paused one last time, turned back to glance at the now empty cabin, a cabin where dignity had been challenged, exposed, and restored. Her gaze lingered for just a moment at seat 2, not because it symbolized status, not because it symbolized victory, but because finally it symbolized belonging. She spoke aloud but quietly, only for Noah to hear. "This seat was never about power. It's about respect, and respect doesn't require a dress code." And with that, Olivia Harris stepped off the aircraft, leaving behind not just a moment, but a legacy. One where respect would be logged, accountability enforced, and dignity restored. Not just for her, but for every passenger who would board Skylight Airlines in the future.